Three people have had their hands up. Can I just ask them each to make a brief question?
Great.
Lightning round. We'll hear all three of them, and then you can wrap it anyway. So here, and then.
I'm Colin. I'm a PhD student in Sweden. I had a slight question going back to the socialism point on the notion of public versus employee ownership. Because you mentioned, for example, in the quantitative easing for the ecological crisis, it seems to be advocating for public ownership there, if I understood it correctly. I'm not sure I did. But you seem to be advocating for worker ownership in almost every other sphere. And I'm wondering, in terms of who the returns come back to, why not public ownership in terms of everyone instead of just worker ownership?
There's one.
Yes, my name is Jim Howell. I'm with the Massachusetts chapter of the Public Banking Institute. The question was related to that. One thing that hasn't been brought up here, which cooperative ownership and democratizing finance does not really address, is the fact that as long as there is a finite or positive cost of capital, economic decisions will be based on economic discounting, which means that you disregard the future, as Keynes put it so adroitly. The long run doesn't matter because on the long run we're all dead. If you don't agree or you regard that point of view as immoral, then you must come up with an economic system that drives the cost of capital to zero, which essentially means the end of capitalism as we know it. Just to give one example of various ways in which that can be done, really quick. The city of Philadelphia during colonial times was the bank. You wanted to get a loan, you went to the city, they gave you a loan, you paid it back with interest. The interest was collected publicly. Therefore, it did not cause a cost of capital or a time value of money to occur because it was only the city that got it. The city didn't need to levy taxes because it was the bank and collected the interest instead. It worked very well for quite a long time. That's just one example. It's not the only one. But it's an issue that I think needs to be addressed by somebody like the Democracy Collaborative at some point.
Get cracking on that. Final question here.
I'm afraid I don't have a question. I mean, I have a lot of questions. I have an answer to your question about South Africa and what happened there. 40 years ago, I was working on a desegregation of the Boston Public Schools and moved from race and schooling to race in South Africa in 1983. I think the quick answer is that people fell victim to elevating tactics to the level of purpose. In other words, to divest or not to divest was always the issue rather than now what. And fortunately, there are people like Pat Tamano and others who are looking at beyond divestment, now what? So I guess there is a question, and I think the answer is something we all can work on. It's been certainly the focus of my life for the last 37 years. And that is, how can we reconnect economic activity to civic virtue? And I think it's possible. There are many entry points. There are many ways of doing that from the ground level that feed directly, as Dana Meadows talks about, into leverage points that can move this along. Because if not now, then when is really the question.
Well, these are all great questions. So the question of public ownership versus worker ownership, I would take out the versus. And what I would say is right now we have basically a monoculture of ownership. We have this idea that capital is going to own everything and that's legitimate. And we need a diversity of kinds of ownership. Commons, worker, community, government. And I think the question is to say, okay, what is appropriate where? For example, like right now, should we have, is the healthcare sector so important that it shouldn't be left to profit maximizing companies, that it should be owned by all of us, it should be there to serve the people? I think we're heading in that direction. I think, we have an idea, we're exploring a publicly owned pharmaceutical. Do we want medicines owned by profit maximizing companies that are going to jack up the price 1,000 times? And that's ludicrous. And so yes. And then other times, I don't think all companies ought to be owned by the government, and I think that probably most people would support that. So what works where? I think that's the question that we are. You raise a very technical question, which I don't think I can really address here. But you're right. Capitalism is accustomed to having very high rates of return, and are those going to be possible if we're going into a slow growth or low growth economy? what's happening now is that they're extracting more from labor. So more and more is going to capital, and less is going to labor. And that can't go on forever. And so there's going to be, who knows what kind of reckoning is going to come there. But Thomas Piketty did talk about how, he said if the growth of the rate of capital exceeds the growth of GDP, right? If GDP is growing 2 or 3% and capital is growing at 6 or 7%, where does that money come from? Where does the rest of it come from? Well, it basically comes from extracting from somebody else or creating some kind of crazy derivatives. So yes, there are some hard questions and some hard choices that we're going to face ahead, and we don't have all the answers here today, but I'm confident that we can find them. So thank you, everyone. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Let's give it up for Marjorie.